Hello and welcome to another lineup review. My name is James McCool. I'm the owner of Pater.ghost.io. We are going to be going over the Week 13 NFL DFS slate today, talking about the models, talking about my lineups, talking about maybe a couple subscriber lineups. But this one's going to be a little bit shorter today. We do have Tuesday night football tonight, so Baltimore versus Dallas, which should of course just be an absolute blast, right? But maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll just be the worst thing on the planet. But regardless, I'm probably going to make this a little bit shorter today, just talk through a couple things and talk through my lineups, talk through the models a little bit, answer some questions if there are any. But if there are not, then that is fine too. So we're just going to kind of jump straight into things here. The models really, really liked Seattle, Minnesota, Green Bay, Tennessee. For the most part, it was really just Seattle, Minnesota, and Green Bay. And Seattle as a team has kind of gone into this more run-heavy approach as of late, which the coaching staff had said that they wanted to do. It's kind of like Pete Carroll's thing that he wants to be a run-heavy team regardless. And all of the passing, they were scoring a lot, but what Carroll associates with allowing a lot of points is the fact that they were not running the ball enough. Instead of saying that their defense has been getting fucking torched, Pete Carroll's blaming it on there not being enough running happening in the game. So they're a bit more run heavy now, and I did note that in my team notes. I had mentioned that Chris Carson was a fantastic play. I had mentioned that I wasn't really confident in Seattle as a team that could support two fantasy wide receivers at this point. So I mentioned just DK Metcalf and Chris Carson as the main plays from that game. That mostly worked out. DK Metcalf was not incredible, but Chris Carson had a really good game and still isn't even fully healthy. Still not even playing to the best of his ability. So I did notice that I'm having a lot of dropped frames on this video. So if you would like to not, worry so much about the video. This one's going to be a quick video anyway, and it'll be up on the site relatively quickly. So just bear with me while we get through the audio, which should still be consistent. Actually, maybe this will help. Maybe we can just do it this way. So another one of the models, or another one of the things that the models liked were, let's see, Minnesota, which turned out to be pretty good. Justin Jefferson ended up being a really, really good play. He put up, I think, 30 fantasy points or something like that. And Dalvin Cook still had like a million touches, which is fine. But I actually expected him to have less touches. I know that there was no Alexander Madison, which made it so that there was the idea that he would have a significant amount more work than he would actually have during this game if Madison was still there. But they do still have Amir Abdullah and Mike Boone, and I kind of thought those guys were going to be taking over the Alexander Madison role and splitting up that backup role. If they and I mean, obviously they didn't. Dalvin Cook touched the ball I think like 40 times or something, 38 times in the game, and racked up to like 24 fantasy points or something like that. It was a really inefficient outing on a per touch basis, and I think that's probably what we are going to continue seeing from Dalvin Cook is a more ineffective rushing game from Minnesota, where he just ran like God for a couple weeks there, and now it's not going to be happening like that. He's beat up. The attrition is getting to him, and the coaching staff wants to go to a more pass-centric game plan anyway, which you can kind of see over the last couple weeks. I think that we're kind of seeing them, especially in the red zone, we're seeing them pass a significant amount more, where they are not worrying so much about the run in the red zone. So that's an interesting thing. But Minnesota stacks actually ended up being okay. Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson were not the worst plays. Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams had the highest chance to be the top scoring stack on the slate, and as it turns out, they were pretty damn close, if not actually getting there. Devontae Adams did put up 37 fantasy points. Aaron Rodgers put up 25 fantasy points. And even Robert Tonyan ended up putting up like 13 or 14 fantasy points or something, caught a touchdown. So that stack was really, really good. The problem was, of course, who do you bring it back with from Philadelphia? The answer, I think, turned out to be Jalen Reagor ended up having a touchdown. Greg Ward ended up having a touchdown after Carson Wentz went out of the game. It was Jalen Hurts that ended up actually doing things for Philadelphia. which that's a true quarterback controversy at this point now. And Carson Wentz has looked absolutely just lost behind a shaky offensive line. He's making bad decisions. He's trying to force things and make things happen that aren't there. But I will say that I think that there is a large piece of it that goes down on the coaching staff, who are trying to get too many hands involved in the kitchen. I think they're playing a lot of different wide receivers they don't need to be playing. It's messing with the I don't know if I would call it momentum, but I think that it's messing with the synergy of the team. Where Travis Fulgham was so good for a couple weeks there, and now he's losing snaps to the corpse of Alshon Jeffrey, which is silly. They should be utilizing their best weapons more and more effectively, and they're just refusing to do it. So I think that there's probably a lot of things wrong with that offense and that team in general. Regardless, I did suggest not to use anybody from Philadelphia as a bringback. And I said that it was Jalen Reagor if you're going to bring anybody back, and he ended up doing okay. So I feel pretty good about that. Green Bay definitely was the top stack. And then the other stacks that we need to talk about, I think, are Tennessee and Houston, where Tennessee I noted as one of my favorite stacks on the slate. I noted that going with a stack that involved Corey Davis was my favorite way to go about it. Corey Davis ended up putting up 38 fantasy points. He absolutely crushed it, which is great. Really, really happy about that. Nailed that. But then I paired him with A.J. Brown, thinking that Anthony Fursker was going to lose a lot of snaps and lose some passing game work to Jeff Swaim, who has been coming up and played 60+% of the snaps over the last couple weeks. And that was partially right. Anthony Fursker still ended up putting up 10 fantasy points. A.J. Brown fucking killed me, fumbling the ball like on the one on a pass that would have been a touchdown for him. It was like a 15-point swing and probably a couple $100 for me. In terms of my week, would have turned my week from a slightly negative week, a week with slight losses, to a week with some pretty good profits. If A.J. Brown ends up catching that touchdown pass. Instead, he fumbles it, doesn't get any more fantasy points for the rest of the game. It goes to the third string tight end, Pruitt or something like that, who picks it up, fumble recovery for a touchdown. Just a brutal fucking swing. Just I run like trash in that instance. But really liked Tennessee and Houston. Houston was fine. It ended up being, like I had mentioned, Brandon Cooks, I don't think that he's a wide receiver one anymore. I don't think that he can really carry that torch going into this Houston offense. He can't do what Will Fuller can do. And I talked about Kiki Kute being the one that you actually wanted in this game. And that was right. Kiki Kute ended up with over 100 yards, 25 fantasy points, 141 yards. On 8 receptions. Brandon Cooks only 65 yards on 5 receptions, but overall the offense was significantly limited, which we know happens when there's no Will Fuller. It turns into a situation where Deshaun Watson doesn't have somebody that can do everything that Will Fuller can do, and historically he's been much worse without Will Fuller on the field. So we kind of knew going into that game that offense is going to be less efficient. They're going up against Indianapolis, who's a pretty good team. And they ended up being kind of a letdown. Deshaun Watson scored fine, 24 fantasy points. Brandon Cooks only 11, and Kiki Kute ended up with 25 fantasy points. So those were kind of like the main stacks I want to talk about. Las Vegas, like Darren Waller ended up just balling the fuck out. He had like 48 fantasy points or something gaudy like that, which is awesome. It's against Jets, so I get it. But Derek Carr gets absolutely just fucking bailed out at the end of that game with that Hail Mary to Henry Ruggs. Ends up catapulting people who ended up with that stack. Regardless, Darren Waller, I mentioned him in every piece of content, I think. Maybe not over at Line Movement, but I mentioned him on most of the pieces of content, and he ended up doing incredibly well. Devontae Booker, the chalk, well, the half chalk of the week, ended up failing, but not really by any fault of his own. Like, he had plenty of red zone chances that just didn't pan out into a touchdown. He still ended up with 6 fantasy points with a reception, 50 rushing yards. If he gets a touchdown, then he's fine. 5.5K in cash, puts up like 13 fantasy points, something like that. But the main distinction, his main counterpart, was David Montgomery, who fell into the end zone twice for 2 touchdowns, and had 72 rushing yards, 39 receiving yards, 4 receptions. So That's one of those like 50-50 decisions where I talked about it in the Discord. That was a true 50-50 decision if you were in cash. I thought that both Myles Gaskin and Austin Eckler were better plays in cash than either one of Dave Montgomery or Devontae Booker. And when you got down to that final decision between those two, it's kind of like, who do you play? Do you play the one that's averaging like zero point 0.6 fantasy points per touch on the year, going into a matchup that isn't really that great? Or do you play the one that is on a team that is a 10-point favorite against the New York Jets, right? That like historically has averaged 5.5 yards per carry. When it comes down to the projections, when it comes down to like the matchups, when it comes down to Vegas, all that kind of stuff is a tiebreaker between two running backs. Like, of course, I'm going to choose Devontae Booker, the one who looks like the better play. Just turned out to not be that way. David Montgomery was like 72% on cash, which I thought was insanity. Devontae Booker was not 72% on cash, so I'm okay with that 1v1. If I end up going with David Montgomery, I think I like sweep cash games or come something close to it. I would have put up a score of like 167. There was one person who fucking waxed me with a 2 tight end build with David Montgomery and Darren Waller with Anthony Fursker, and that was just like brutal. But outside of that, I think that overall, like this week had a lot of things that made a lot of sense. Being on Green Bay and Tennessee and Minnesota, talking about Seattle being the Chris Carson show this week, like all those things mostly made sense. So feel pretty good about the analysis as the slate overall. We can move on to my lineups now, which we will do like this. I mean, I know that like I still have frames dropping, but it's just a still screen, so we're just going to do it this way. As we are looking at this is my cash game lineup. This is a cash game lineup up against Crafty Lefty, who is the one that I usually show in these. He usually takes my head-to-heads. So he's a good player. We can kind of compare against him. So he ended up with Deshaun Watson against my Aaron Rodgers. We both had Myles Gaskin and Devontae Booker. His difference was that he also used Dave Montgomery instead of Austin Eckler. And if you would have offered me straight up Austin Eckler versus Dave Montgomery in fantasy points, even fantasy adjusted fantasy point or price adjusted fantasy points, like I'm taking Austin Eckler all day. So I don't mind that at all, having that 1v1. We both had Devontae Adams. We both had Brandon Cooks. He did end up with Cooper Kupp, where I had Keke Coutee. So that was another like straight, like the 2v2 that we had was I had Austin Eckler and Keke Coutee, and he had Cooper Kupp and Dave Montgomery. So I'll take my side on that, like most times out of most times. We also both had Anthony Fursker. He had the Falcons defense, and I had the Seahawks defense. So there are a lot of similarities here. The difference at defense, like I don't really care. That's kind of negligible unless there's one defense that is like an obvious play in cash games. But the 2v2 of Austin Eckler and Keke Coutee against Cooper Kupp and Dave Montgomery, that one, you know, I'll take that as a coin flip. It could have gone either way. We both put up just about 150. He beat me by 2.44 fantasy points or something like that. That's like, you know, one reception more to Austin Eckler in a game that's not 45-0, right? So I don't mind the way that I built out cash games. I think I only had like a 40% win rate or something like that this week. But I broke even in cash games. So I feel pretty good about that. We will move on to GPPs. So in GPPs, I had this is not the correct contest. One sec there, homies. I'm winning $60 in CSGO right now. Let's get back to... There we go. All right, these are my lineups. All right, so I had a Tennessee stack. I had a Green Bay stack. And I also had an Atlanta stack. And the Atlanta stack was this fucking close to doing really, really well. And I'll talk through each one of these like individually, but I talked a lot about Tennessee being my favorite stack this week. They ended up doing the best for me. I also talked about Green Bay. And then this Atlanta stack actually was originally an Arizona stack. I started this with Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, and bringing it back with Josh Reynolds. And then as it turned out, as I was building out, I knew that I wanted a Julio Jones and Michael Thomas combination in every lineup. I had that in every single lineup that I built this week. I just thought they were both vastly underpriced, like $6,600 Julio Jones and $7K Michael Thomas playing against each other. Like, I want all of that every single week. And if people aren't going to be on Julio Jones again next week at low ownership at a low price, then I'll go back to that again. I talked a lot about how I thought that he was just like, if Julio Jones ended up with 36 fantasy points this week at 6,600 and 6% ownership, then everybody in the industry would just be screaming at themselves and just be so mad that they like ignored a $6,600 Julio Jones. So having him at 6% owned, I thought was fantastic. Having Michael Thomas, who I knew people wouldn't be on, but has been getting just like an absurd amount of the air yards and targets for New Orleans since Taysom Hill took over. I mean, we're talking like 70% of the air yards and 50% of the targets. If that turned out to be a game where they had to pass, Michael Thomas was going to get absolutely fucking fed. So with that line of thinking, after I plugged in DeAndre Hopkins and Josh Reynolds, I started building out, and I knew that I liked Austin Eckler. I knew that I wanted Michael Thomas and Julio Jones, and then I was looking at the tight end landscape, which was just atrocious this week, and figured that Hayden Hurst is somebody who has been getting some pretty good work when Matt Ryan has been healthy, when Julio Jones has been playing, when this offense has been playing at the top of its actual game. And so after looking at that and kind of like deciding on the Michael Thomas situation and the Julio Jones situation, the only way that Michael Thomas was actually going to really get there was if he was having to catch passes from a Saints team that was trailing. And if that happens, that means that Atlanta ended up having a really, really good game. When Atlanta has really good games, it comes through Matt Ryan, it comes through Julio Jones. So that led me to an Atlanta stack, which worked out really well. I mean, I'm not mad about this. All these guys kind of like performed to expectation, right? Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, they were 6 yards away from Julio Jones with a 100-yard bonus. We were 27 yards away from the Matt Ryan 300-yard bonus, and he only had one passing touchdown. Michael Thomas ended up with 9 receptions, 105 yards. So, like, in another world, like a not too far away situation, Matt Ryan throws for 3 touchdowns, Julio Jones crushes, and Michael Thomas crushes. We were pretty close to having some pretty decent scores here from this lineup overall. DeAndre Hopkins ended up with 8 receptions and a touchdown, 52 yards. Pretty lackluster performance. Kyler Murray is just not performing very well right now. Josh Reynolds ended up not doing very well, but the Rams were just kind of in control of the game the entire time, and I was really hoping for a shootout there. I talked about Austin Eckler. He was a really, really good play this week, even at 25% owned. 7,100 is too cheap for him. And the usage that he gets, they got blown out 45-0, which is wild. I'm surprised that Anthony Lynn did not lose his job last week. And then David Johnson I used as leverage off of the Houston chalk, which I knew would be there with Brandon Cooks and Deshaun Watson and Keke Coutee. And he was also really good leverage off of the other like mid 5K running backs, right? Like he was about the same price as David Montgomery, about the same price as Myles Gaskin, about the same price as Devontae Booker. So using him as direct and indirect leverage, I thought was a really, really good spot here in GPPs. And then I used the Jets defense because whatever. They were 2,100 and the Raiders suck. So this lineup didn't actually end up doing all that well, but you can see kind of like the thought behind it. And I do really like the way that it turned out. It just didn't quite get there. So if Matt Ryan and Julio Jones end up doing their thing, then Michael Thomas does his thing. We're still hoping, obviously, that Arizona and the Rams work out, but for the most part, like I like the way this lineup turned out. We had some serious floor performances here from Eckler, Reynolds, and Hurst, but it is what it is. Moving on to the next lineup. This is the Green Bay lineup, and this one's really, really funny. So this lineup was Aaron Rodgers with Devontae Adams. I did not bring anybody back from Philadelphia. I said that I didn't really care to. After what Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf did to the Eagles last week, there was really no reason for me to like think that Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams could not do the same thing. So I didn't mind using them alone. and not bringing anybody back. And what that allowed was me to have a whole bunch of extra secondary correlations, right? I had Corey Davis against Austin Hooper, and I thought that Corey Davis was in a fantastic spot. I talked about it a lot. And then Austin Hooper was a tight end that people were not recognizing in a game that had the highest over-under on the slate. So using those two against each other, it's wild that Austin Hooper only had 4.4 fantasy points with Cleveland scoring 41, but I digress. Those two, I really like that combination. And then, like I said, Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, talked a lot about that already. And then I went. So when I talked in my leverage in the team notes this week, I mentioned that one of the ways that you could be different this week was simply by avoiding the 5K running back range, because so much of the ownership in GPPs was going to land on those guys that avoiding that entirely would make you unique without even having to worry about ownerships elsewhere. I thought that Kerryon Johnson was not getting enough recognition for the workload that he had on Thursday night during the Thanksgiving game with no DeAndre Swift. As it turns out, they did not plan to use Kerryon Johnson the same way. He did get injured, to my dismay, as did Frank Gore. So like the run bat on this, where I had two $4,400 running backs that were 5% or less owned in spots where people were not recognizing that they were good plays. Like Ty Johnson ended up having a career day against that Raiders team for the Jets, and Frank Gore got injured after 2 rushing yards. Kerryon Johnson ended up, getting injured midway through the game. They weren't using him a whole bunch, but still the injury means that they weren't able to use him when the game got competitive down the stretch. So like, having those 2 injuries sucks, but it is what it is. I just wanted to punt running back in this one so that I could end up getting a whole bunch of upside from Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, Devontae Adams. And that was the game plan, and it unfortunately failed pretty hard. In a week where all of like the chalk running backs ended up doing really, really well with with the main chalk running back doing really, really well with Dave Montgomery. It just is what it is. Like, if you fade that and your guys get injured in the first quarter and the chalk running backs end up putting up combined 55 fantasy points, shit happens, and you can't really do anything about that. But I liked the way this was put together. I liked the correlations that were put together. 2 secondary stacks here with Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams. Couldn't ask for too much more from Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams. And like, these two were literally 6 yards and a touchdown away from being a fantastic combination that ends up doing pretty well in GPPs. All right, final lineup. So this is my Tennessee stack. I went with Ryan Tannehill, A.J. Brown, and Corey Davis. I ended up bringing this one back with Kareem Hunt, which I thought was a unique way to end up using a comeback in GPPs. We know that Kareem Hunt is the running back that they prefer to use when they're in passing situations, and he does get quite a bit of red zone work as well. So I built this lineup thinking that Tennessee was going to get out to a pretty decent lead up against Cleveland through the passing game, and then hope that Kareem Hunt would be getting the majority of the work in the second half over Nick Chubb, which was direct leverage against Nick Chubb and direct leverage against Derrick Henry as well. So being able to leverage both of those positions with one player was pretty nice. I also had the secondary correlations of Julio Jones and Michael Thomas, as well as a secondary correlation of Myles Gaskin against Drew Sample. Drew Sample ended up with, I think, 4 targets, maybe 6 targets the week before. Looked like somebody that Brandon Allen was kind of like really looking to the majority of the game. And again, he had 7 receptions for 49 yards. It looks like Drew Sample is going to kind of be the guy for Brandon Allen so long as he is a starting quarterback this year. It wasn't a spot that I absolutely loved, but using him in the game script that Miami has a lead most of the game and Myles Gaskin is kind of salting things out. Drew Sample is getting receptions in the second half. Like, that makes sense. That kind of game environment made a lot of sense. It was cheap, and it let me use correlation in the tight end spot, which is something that I always try to do. Myles Gaskin, 90 rushing yards and a fumble. Like, if he gets 10 more rushing yards, then he puts up 20 plus fantasy points. Like, I can say that about so many players I had this week, where it's like I had an injury, or I had like a fumble, or I had 10 yards short of a 100-yard bonus. Like, there were so many things that would have just added a little bit more ROI to the lineups that I had, but it is what it is. This one especially was super tilting with that A.J. Brown fumble instead of a touchdown. Ryan Tannehill still ended up doing very, very well, 389 yards and 3 passing touchdowns and 2-point conversion. But really, really would have liked that to have that connection between him and A.J. Brown. It's worth noting that A.J. Brown did actually have an injury in this game as well. So those were all of my lineups. As I said, this is going to be a shorter video, so I think that we are going to cut it off here, especially because my internet doesn't want to cooperate with me right now, and my frames are dropping like crazy. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm going to post this up over on the site here pretty soon for those who were not able to tune into the stream. If you have questions, you can hit me up on Twitter or in the Discord. I'm always happy to help or give any advice that I possibly can. If you're not a subscriber to paydirt.ghost.io, go over there and subscribe. It's only $25 a month for now, and then we got NBA season coming up here pretty soon. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for the support. I hope you guys had a good week of NFL DFS, and let's have a great showdown slate tonight.